On the 19th, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced that a joint delegation of Arab and Islamic countries' foreign ministers will visit China from November 20th to 21st. This delegation includes members from Saudi Arabia such as Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal, Jordan's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Safadi, Egypt's Foreign Minister Shawkri, Indonesia's Foreign Minister Retno, Palestine's Foreign Minister Maliki, and the Secretary General of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Taha. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs stated that China and the delegation will engage in deep communication and coordination to promote the cooling down of the current Israel-Palestine conflict, protect civilians, and fairly resolve the Palestinian issue. It's known that Chinese diplomacy has always adhered to a balanced, neutral stance, refraining from actively intervening in other countries' or regions' affairs. However, amidst the escalating Israel-Palestine conflict, the joint visit of the Arab and Islamic foreign ministers supporting Palestine to China to openly discuss fairly resolving the Palestinian issue signifies China's stance. Following China's facilitation of reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran in March, this can be seen as the second major move from China and possibly one of the most significant developments since the eruption of the Israel-Palestine conflict. This indicates that China might be responding to the calls for morality, taking up a corresponding role in the Middle East. In this video, we'll focus on the Islamic World United's visit to China, discussing the following: new perspectives on Middle East issues, the sole choice, China, China's increasing involvement in Middle Eastern affairs, America's dilemma. The joint visit by the Arab and Islamic delegation carries various underlying influential factors. Firstly, with Israel's aggressive incursion into Gaza, discontent toward Israel from the Islamic world is growing rapidly, especially after Israel's unilateral declaration of indefinite comprehensive security responsibility over Gaza upon completely occupying its northern region. What does indefinite comprehensive security responsibility mean? In essence, it implies permanent occupation. This has shifted the Middle East's perception of Israel's belligerent stance. The current issue isn't solely about safeguarding Gaza or whether Palestine can establish a state, but is now about the perceived threat from Israel's aggressive expansion across the entire Middle East. However, feeling threatened and responding to the threat are two different matters. The vulnerability of Arab nations in the Middle East is evident. They've long been pawns in Western Middle Eastern policies, engaging in prolonged mutual hostility and infighting, rendering their collective power fragmented. If they continue down the same path as before, with the U.S. involvement, these Arab nations might squabble among themselves without taking concrete actions. Yet, this time, the situation is different. Just a few days ago, the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation held a summit in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, solely to discuss the Israel-Palestine situation. This summit had two key highlights. Firstly, for the first time in over a decade, the president of Iran visited Saudi Arabia and attended the summit in its capital. Secondly, they jointly proposed conditions for establishing normal relations with Israel, stipulating the necessity of relinquishing occupation over Palestinian territories to enable an independent Palestinian state. Iran and Saudi Arabia respectively represent two major forces in the Middle East. Now, with both leaders sitting together, shaking hands, and discussing how to collectively counter Israel alongside their respective allies, it represents the collective stance of Arab nations in the Middle East toward Israel. In the fragmented Middle East, where Israel could act with impunity, the unified Middle East, led by the two major powers, Saudi Arabia and Iran, appears significantly stronger in countering Israel's actions. Of course, Israel has the support of the United States, and the U.S. still maintains absolute influence in the Middle East. For the recently united Middle East, there's an urgent need to find a force that can counterbalance the U.S. There are two choices: Russia or China. Russia has traditionally been a player in the Middle East, but currently, Russia is preoccupied and fundamentally unable to reassert itself on the Middle Eastern stage. Therefore, China has become the most optimal and only choice. Moreover, the significant reconciliation in the Middle East brought about by Shah-IS diplomatic relations is facilitated by China. Various Arab factions have developed a considerable level of trust in China. So, right after the Arab-Islamic Summit, the first major move was this joint visit of the Arab-Iranian foreign minister's delegation to China. For China, due to its commitment to a neutral foreign policy, its actions in the Middle East have been relatively limited, and its willingness to engage in conflicts in the region has not been very strong. But now the situation is different. With the escalating confrontation between China and the US. In recent years, their rivalry no longer stays limited to the Taiwan Strait. Key regions, including the Middle East, have become crucial arenas for competition and strategic maneuvering between China and the US. It's difficult for China to remain aloof. Or to put it plainly, intervening to advance the Israeli-Palestinian peace process aligns with China's interests within the context of the global confrontation between China and the US. Firstly, with Israel's deepening incursion, clashes have erupted between Israel and Lebanon. U.S. military bases in Syria and Iraq have been repeatedly attacked. Iran even claims that Israel's attacks on civilians make the inevitable expansion of the war imminent. It can be said that with Israel unlikely to cease fire in the short term, the Israel-Palestine conflict is uncontrollably evolving into a regional war. And once this pivotal point in the Middle East, bridging Asia and Europe, erupts into a regional war involving multiple countries, its impact will far surpass the current Israel-Palestine conflict. Global powers, including China and the US, will be involuntarily drawn in various ways. At that point, the current bipolar international confrontation led by China and the US will inevitably intensify, resembling a new Cold War. This is not a scenario China wishes to witness. So, during the recent China-US summit, why did Biden invite China to intervene in the Middle East conflict? Why was there a specific focus on discussing Iran? It's because in preventing the escalation of conflicts in the Middle East, China and the US have common interests. Secondly, Israel's ruthless slaughter in the Gaza Strip has sparked international outrage. Under the biased support from the West, it reeks of the strong bullying the weak. For countries outside the Western world, it's akin to reliving their own history of colonial oppression. Thus, unlike the Russia-Ukraine conflict, in this conflict, many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have reignited an anti-Western wave. There's widespread sympathy for the vulnerable Palestinians, viewing this conflict as a struggle against colonialism and racism. Against the backdrop of growing dissatisfaction among Southern countries with the current international system, this wave will significantly erode the current dominance of the West, including the US. At this moment, representing the vast Southern countries, China raising its voice can not only enhance its leadership in global trends but also serve as a counterbalance against the pressure from the US. Since Biden took office, a key focus in foreign policy has been withdrawing from the Middle East to concentrate efforts on containing China in the Indo-Pacific. However, it appears that Israel's unilateral actions are likely to shatter Biden's aspirations. Not to mention that Netanyahu won't voluntarily cease fire in the short term, even if a ceasefire were to occur. Given Israel's current surrounding circumstances, the US might find it challenging to disentangle itself from the complexities of the Middle East for an extended period. Now, with the joint visit of Arab and Iranian nations to China, seeking China's intervention to restore fairness, American and Israeli freedom of action in the Middle East will inevitably face greater constraints. The US might inevitably have to invest more effort in this region. Adding to the mix is Europe's entanglement in the war quagmire with Zelensky. At this point, one wonders how Biden, constrained by circumstances, can still pivot to the Indo-Pacific. In essence, for China, its intervention in the Middle East situation isn't merely about mediating between conflicting parties or providing humanitarian assistance. It's a strategic move to exert pressure on and balance against the US, restraining it from unilaterally supporting Israel in the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's about instigating a confrontation between Israel and the entire Islamic world in the Middle East, creating an uncontrollable situation. For China, addressing the Middle East situation might entail more actions than words. China has consistently adhered to a foreign policy of non-interference in other countries' internal affairs, but humanitarian aid is a responsibility of a responsible major power, and it must be undertaken. By pushing for humanitarian aid, encouraging brief or intermittent ceasefires between Israel and Palestine, China demonstrates its efforts. China won't fully involve itself in Middle Eastern affairs, but after reaching consensus with Arab and Islamic nations, it can unite with all possible forces within the international community, engaging in strategic moves to inconvenience the US. This pressure could force the US to readjust its Middle East strategy and support for Israel, while also rallying Islamic nations to pressurize Israel. In essence, China has considerable room to maneuver in promoting peace between Israel and Palestine. This is the end of this video. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment. We genuinely appreciate your support.